World Refugee Day is marked every year on June 20th, honouring refugees around the globe and celebrating their strength and courage. To mark this day this year, the market research company Ipsos carried out a global survey across 28 countries, and they found that attitudes towards refugees have become more positive since last year, with 78% agreeing that people escaping war or persecution should be able to take refuge in other countries, including their own. The Ukraine crisis is thought to have contributed to people's changing attitudes. South Korea also saw a jump up by 10 percentage points to 61% agreeing in such a principle. However, that was the lowest amongst countries surveyed. To talk more about World Refugee Day and South Korea's role, we have joining us via video now James Lynch, head of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees here in Korea. Mr. Lynch, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for doing a program on World Refugee Day.
Can you first tell us more about World Refugee Day? How and why was this day first founded?
It's interesting because when I joined UNHCR more than 30 years ago, it was Africa Refugee Day, and it was celebrated to commemorate the 1969 OAU Convention dealing with refugees, which came into force on June 20, 1974. And then during our High Commissioner, Madam Ogata, she asked the General Assembly to make 20 June World Refugee Day as a way, as you correctly said in your introductory remarks, not to celebrate the day, but to mark the day, but celebrate the achievements and the contributions refugees make globally.
Yes, we reached a grim milestone this year. The number of people forced to flee conflict, war and persecution crossed 100 million for the first time. That is double the population of South Korea. So with that in mind, how did the UNHCR Korea office mark the day this year, World Refugee Day?
Well, we've had a number of events, but I think, as you said, reaching 100 million is the first time in our history. And that's equivalent to, the 14th largest country. So, it's a milestone that we all take with great sadness, that instead of finding solutions and people going back home, for the first time, we've reached a number that we have never reached before in our history. I think as a lead up to World Refugee Day, we always have a number of events. And as you rightfully said, there has been some public approval of refugees, which may be from the Ukraine situation or other factors. But it's been very important to try to highlight different audiences. And so therefore, we've conducted a film festival, which was done with the Korean Refugee Rights Network. We showed a number of films. Some of them were documentaries UNHCR produced. One in particular comes to mind about belonging. And then also what we tried to do is highlight, on and online events and offline events. And this time we tried to put up some posters in subway stops to try to reach a different audience. And then we had a symposium, which is more for practitioners or those working in the field of refugee law and refugee rights-based organizations to, learn from each other, and also to have that information from those rights groups disseminated down to a larger population.
Right, so the UN...
Because we believe, I think, as you said, more understanding of what it means to flee and be uprooted brings more compassion.
Right, so the UNHCR Korea office has been active in promoting the day on various fronts. How does that fit into the broader context of what the UNHCR Korea office aims to do? Can you tell us more about your office's role in South Korea?
Well, on the legal side of it, we work very closely with the Ministry of Justice and looking into how the asylum procedures work. We've just conducted workshops with the Ministry of Justice where we share information on good practices. We also look into cases where people may have been denied refugee status here and whether there's grounds for an appeal and taking through the process. That's one side. The other side, as we just discussed, is public awareness raising to try to explain the situation of refugees, their plight throughout the world on a more global thing, and also looking at the small number of refugees who have been granted status here. And that's some of the work we do. And then the other work comes with fundraising. Korea has been very generously giving to UNHCR for quite some time now. That's not just from the government funding, which we're greatly appreciative of, but also individual giving, and in some cases in the private sector from corporations. So those are the three pillars of the office here.
You talk about South Korea's role. I understand this year marks the 30th anniversary Korea joined the Convention relating to the status of refugees, and it's also the 10th anniversary of the country's Refugee Act. How has Korea managed the refugee situation over the years, in your view? For example, do we know how many refugees and humanitarian status holders are residing in South Korea currently?
I know when we just talked about reaching 100 million, and we talk about more than 7 million people fleeing Ukraine, and then you add on to that probably close to that number internally displaced, these numbers sound very, very small. And it's about 3,600 refugees and humanitarian status holders in Korea, of which 1,194 have been given refugee status, and 2,424 have been given humanitarian status, which is a form of protection while they're here. But Korea, as you rightfully said, is one of the few countries, if not the first country in Asia, to have signed the 1951 convention and set up domestic legislation and have a completely functioning asylum system.
Right. So as we said, 3,600, not a huge number, but we do believe South Korea is the first country in Asia to enact an independent domestic law to implement the Refugee Convention. In your view, then, how does South Korea's Refugee Act fare now, and could there still be improvements?
Well, I've worked now, I think this is my 13th or 14th country. In some countries I worked, they haven't signed the convention. There's no domestic legislation, and UNHCR has to do the refugee status determination than ourselves. And other countries, they have signed the convention, introduced some kind of decree or local legislation, but not always have had the most effective asylum system. I mean, Korea's system, it meets international standards and can be upheld as something for other countries in the region, if not globally, to emulate. And I think I'd be remiss not to say that any system is never perfect. I'm sure that, things are lost sometimes in translation when you have to deal with, over the last 5 years, Korea has had close to 50,000 people seeking asylum from various countries. I'm sure there are language issues. There's also ways of one expressing oneself. To be individually determined a refugee under the convention, you have to have established individual persecution. When I used to interview Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, I asked, "Why did you leave?" They said, "I came to get a job." That's not a ground in the convention, but
Right.
one had to interview further. What does it mean? You wanted a job, you couldn't find one at home? Yes, because I couldn't have access to education. There were travel restrictions in my country that prevented me to move to urban areas, and I couldn't obtain any documents, so therefore I could not even join a migrant worker pool of Myanmar nationals that sometimes find themselves in Korea and in other places. And another positive thing, when you look at and you say 3,600, well, it's not a very large number. It percentage-wise, and I'm not the best at math, but it's something like 0.0007% of the population of Korea. And that includes, both refugees and humanitarians. holders. But if you look also what Korea did after the coup in Myanmar in February last year, they introduced a legislation that said, an act that said stay order, which said that no one would be forcibly returned to their place of origins, regardless of their status here. Now, most of those people were on a legal status, but should they find themselves coming to the end of their visa and was not able to renew their migrant worker status, no one would be forcibly sent home. And that was also done for Afghans and Ukrainians, which is a form of protection that is envisioned in the Global Compact for Refugees, which is an important new step in refugee law and procedures.
Right, so South Korea's refugee system meets international standards and is active been to try and help refugees. But as you hinted at earlier, there is sometimes a negative perception of refugees in Korea that your office is trying to change. We mentioned the Ipsos survey earlier. You've been with the UNHCR Korea since 2019, as you mentioned. Before you came to Seoul in 2018, there had been presidential petitions and protests against Yemeni refugees who had entered the country through Jeju Island. Have you noticed any change in the way Koreans see refugees during your time here?
You see, I can't explain how under 500 people arriving in a country with over 50 million could create a crisis. I was a representative and regional coordinator based in Bangkok when more than 600,000 people crossed from Myanmar into Bangladesh, creating in one of the most populous countries in the world, maybe the third or fourth largest city almost overnight. I don't know why people perceive this as a threat. Was it that there wasn't, it took them as surprise? Yemen is so far away. It was known in the UN system as a forgotten conflict where people, was it the demographics of the group or predominant, and in this case, all male? Was it factors related to religious prejudice? This I can't, but from my time in Korea, I find Korea a welcoming country. And I think if you look at the special contributors that were brought from Afghanistan, the 390, so look at the perception there was no negative fallout. Matter of fact, when we were offered a donation to these Afghans, the Ministry of Justice said they've already received too much. Perhaps it could be given to other refugees and asylum seekers in Korea.
Last year, 391 Afghan evacuees, I believe, were allowed to enter South Korea after the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, of course. And it was actually rather touching to see as well on Sunday, some of them being invited to attend the so-called housewarming event at the new presidential office in Yongsan and seeing the Afghan refugee children taking pictures with President Yoon as well. So on this day to mark World Refugee Day, what message would you like to leave our listeners with today, Mr. Lynch, to those here in Korea and elsewhere?
Let me start by saying 감사합니다. Thank you very much for all the support that you've given UNHCR, and not just the financial support that we've received from individual donors, private sector corporations, the generous contributions from the government of Korea, the quick response during the COVID pandemic of donating masks for refugees. But thank you very much for welcoming those that are here and for understanding the plight of refugees. As I say, it may have been more than 70 years ago, but Koreans have understood what it means to have gone through conflict, to be uprooted, to have to rebuild lives either here in Korea or for those that left the country at that time of the conflict. Thank you for your understanding, and let's hope that the next World Refugee Day, the numbers will have gone substantially down. 2 years ago, I was on a TV broadcast, and I echoed what our High Commissioner said. to world leaders, put us out of business, that would be the greatest achievement ever. No one took on that call, but let's hope for that the world will become a better place and that people will be able to go where they ultimately want to, which is to return home.
Indeed. Well, Mr. Lynch, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. We've been speaking to James Lynch, the representative of UNHCR Korea. Thank you once again for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.